So we're going to continue with the social construction of gender relations. One of the perspectives that Kimmel reminds us to keep in mind in reference to gender is gender through the life course. And looking at gender through the life course gives us a really powerful way to see gender as something more fluid that doesn't just happen in the early parts of your life where you create your character in reference to appropriate gender roles and based on biological cues, and then after you reach adulthood it somehow stops. When you're looking at it from a sociological perspective, and especially if you're looking at it through the social construction of gender, this just is not the case. Gender is much more fluid than we've given it credit for in the past, and sociologists are really trying to unpack how gender takes place over the life course. Of course, the chief agents of socialization, the chief institutions that help us define who we are in reference to gender over time are the family, education, and religion. Those are the traditional ways of, or the traditional institutions that we've looked at historically in reference to defining who we are as males as being masculine, or who we are as females being feminine. But although those are necessary, they aren't sufficient. Peer groups and media have proven to be influential over the life course of individuals. The peer groups in the media are impacting through the early years of individuals' character development, but they certainly continue to hold importance as the traditional institutions of the family, education, and religion begin to be less influential. The peer groups and media pick up when those other institutions fall off to the wayside, and then continue to influence individuals throughout their course of life. We can see, of course, gender through the life course in reference to aging. Kimmel talks about the midlife crisis and how individuals tend to have life crises, maybe not midlife crises, and they deal with those life crises as they take shape. And there's nothing gender-based on the male midlife crisis. Those are they're no more prevalent than female crises in general. Another way of thinking about gender and aging would be to think about divorce. It is seen appropriate in our society if a male divorces a woman, a male divorces a female, a man divorces his wife, because of whatever reasons they choose to separate. And when the male goes out shopping for a new mate, it's okay to pick someone that is 20 to 30 years your junior. That's seen as appropriate. Whereas when a female or a wife who is divorced goes out and does the same thing, she is constructed in a more negative way. It's more appropriate for a man to marry a woman who is younger than him than it is for a woman to marry a man that is younger than her. For some reason, the woman who marries an older man is not questioned about why she's doing it. But when a man marries an older woman, there's always the question of the ulterior motives. What exactly is he marrying her for. And the assumption is that it certainly isn't love or caring. It's something more material. So the authors remind us that gender, it's inappropriate or insufficient to simply see gender in reference to identity. As a matter of fact, the book talks about gender in reference to three categories: identity, interaction, and institution. And so it's important. I'm just going to pull a little bit from the book here real quick. When they begin talking about gender as an institution. So one of the most significant sociological points of departure from sexual theory concerns the institutional level of analysis. As we saw, sexual theory holds that gender is a property of individuals, that gendered people acquire their gender identity and move outward into society to populate gender-neutral institutions. To a sociologist, however, those institutions are themselves gendered. Institutions create normative standards, express a gendered institutional logic, and are major factors in the reproduction of gender inequality. The gendered identity of individuals shapes those gendered institutions, and the gendered institutions express and reproduce the inequalities that compose gender identity. This is structure and agency working once again. In order to understand social construction of reality, you really need to understand how the individual interacts with society and how society interacts with the individual, because they both interact and they're both doing gender. The individual is understanding him or herself in reference to their interactions with others and their interactions within gendered institutions themselves. This forces us to recognize that the institutions themselves express a logic. The institutions reproduce gender relations between men and women, and the gender order of hierarchy of power is established. And this hierarchy of power is seen in light of those who possess the power. And in our society, and in many societies for thousands of years, males have dominated over females. As we see, institutions accomplish the creation of gender difference and the reproduction of the gendered order through a series of strategies. The production of gendered divisions, so the gendering of jobs and wages, hierarchies, power and subordination. All we have to talk about here is the gendering of wages. Females in the United States tend to make about 3/4 of a dollar for every dollar a male makes in the same position. Construction of symbols and images is also important. When we see images of success, it's often the man that is succeeding. We see doctors, and the doctors are men, the nurses are women. Lawyers, the lawyers are men. The clerks are women. We also see an interaction between individuals. So gender happens between individuals as well. And within those individuals, you have a power dynamic of language. We see an internal mental work of individuals as well. Gender is interpreted through dress, speech, presentation of self. And one of the things that I've always found fascinating is, especially with language and the presentation of self, is how males tend to interact in conversations different than females. And males, when it comes to interactions with males, they will defer. They will defer to the other in a conversation just as much as females would when they're in interactions with females. But when males and females get together, males become much more dominant and females become much more submissive. So gender might not play out within each group. That's each group arguing that there's some sort of some dichotomous masculine feminine reality out there. But when the two groups get together, men tend to dominate women more than the other way around. So this leads us to this idea of doing gender, where gender is less a component of identity, i.e. fixed and static, that we take with us into our interactions than it is the product of those interactions themselves. Doing gender is the process of constantly and consistently performing the behaviors and activities expected of our sex. So this brings us closer to Erving Goffman's ideas on dramaturgy, that we are out there, or referring back to Shakespeare, all the world is a stage and we are merely actors within it. Well, but what that's saying is that, is in reference to gender, is that we are doing gender, we're performing gender every time we interact with individuals in society or the institutions within our society. We are constantly doing gender, and our performances are going to change depending on which group we're interacting with. Our gender roles might be much more tempered when we're talking to our conservative father than they would when you're hanging out with your crazy Northern California friends out at a music festival half naked. So it's the performance of gender that is played out in our interactions and shift depending on the appropriate performance necessary for the groups that you're interacting in. So doing gender is complex. And we know because we can generally only assume someone's sex based on secondary sex characteristics. But we also rely on how people dress, speak, and behave, what they like, dislike, believe, etc., to determine their gender. So it's not as simple as looking for the presence of breasts or a penis that gives us an indication of the gender of the individual that we're constructing. It's much more complex than that. This idea of intersexuality and fixing sex to align with binary gender systems just doesn't play out in reality. We see all kinds of individuals interpreting what it means to be masculine and feminine throughout society. Cross-dressing is a good example. Transgender individuals, non-binary, gender non-conforming, and gender queer individuals. Gender is in flux, especially now. And you as individuals are really going to need to pay attention if you're going to address individuals in the ways that they feel are tied to who they are, especially in reference to gender.